Avraham Hermon of JMB Davis Ben-David sat down with Dr. Yehudah Livneh, an experienced patent attorney and former vice president of intellectual property at a major pharmaceuticals company, now working as an independent consultant, to discuss the topic of patent waivers in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. They discussed the importance of patents, how they protect against competition, and how waiving this right is affecting pharmaceutical companies and treatments for COVID-19. Views and opinions expressed in this interview belong solely to the authors and do not necessarily reflect the view of JMB Davis Ben-David. Content in this interview should not be considered legal advice, and you should seek appropriate counsel for your own situation.
Welcome. I'm here with Yehudah Livneh. Yehudah is my mentor. He interviewed me for my first job at Teva Pharmaceutical Industries about 18 years ago when I started there. And Yehudah is an expert on patents and policy.
I was at Teva Pharmaceuticals, started there in 1990. I essentially built up the patent department at Teva Pharmaceuticals over a period of just about 25 years. I retired from Teva some 5 years ago. While I was there, I was active on both the generic side of pharmaceutical industry and the innovative side of the pharmaceutical industry, and I got very much involved in policy as well, patent policy, pharmaceutical policy, changing patent laws around the world. That became my second beat while I was at Teva. And I retired from Teva about 5 years ago, and now I primarily work as a consultant to a few companies in the field of patents and pharmaceuticals mostly, and I work with NGOs as well on social action side.
I think that you're probably a perfect person to talk to about our topic today, which is patent waivers. Patent waivers have been in the news a lot lately, having to do with COVID-19 and the vaccine technology. But before we talk about patent waivers, I think it's probably important for our listeners to get a little bit of a feel for what the motivation is for the patent system. And why do we need patents to begin with? Why are they important? What do they do?
Patent system goes back several hundred years, back to France and England in the 1600s. It was enshrined in the Constitution in the U.S. in the late 1700s. Patents are basically a contract between society and the inventor, with the idea that the inventor discloses an invention, makes it available to the public, and in return the public gives the inventor a patent, which prevents anybody else from marketing that invention for a specific period of time. That specific period of time now is generally 20 years. It's changed over the years. And it's really a contract. The inventor has to disclose all aspects of the invention, has to make it possible for somebody else to do it. But anybody else can't really do it and sell it during the term of the patent. So it's to advance technology. The inventor makes it known to everybody, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel each time. Everybody knows what the wheel looks like, but instead you can spend your time on making a more aerodynamic wheel, or you can spend your time on a more aerodynamic car and not have to reinvent the wheel, as it were.
So here, there's this patent term that now is 20 years, and that gives an incentive, essentially, to innovate and to make new products, to invest in R&D, right? So in your experience, how does that incentivize companies, especially in the pharmaceutical and biotech field?
The way the story goes is it takes a long time to develop a pharmaceutical and takes an enormous amount of money to develop a pharmaceutical, to bring it to market. And you're sinking a lot of money in that whole period of time. It can take years and years to bring a pharmaceutical to market. And by the time you take into account the costs of failed attempts to make a product, products which fail in the preclinical trials, and then large clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. That's all a pretty big investment. And the idea is that people would not be willing to sink that amount of money to develop a pharmaceutical if they didn't have a return on it. And that return is essentially the patent, being able to market that product for 20 years without any competition. During those 20 years, you can charge a relatively high price. You have no competition. And you can make the money back. You can make a profit, which you can then sink in to develop other pharmaceuticals and so on and so forth. If you were to stop that, then why should I bother developing a pharmaceutical? I'm not going to make any money on it. It's a purely free market economy, capitalistic idea that we are incentivizing people to put in money and they will get a good return on their money because they have a patent that protects their product. Because otherwise, basically when I sell you a simple pharmaceutical, penicillin or whatever, any chemist can reverse engineer it and see what the ingredient is. It's an easy product to reverse engineer, to see what it is. And if I didn't have a patent on it, I'm giving it to you. I'm selling it to you for $1 a pill, $2 a pill. You reverse engineer it and you come out with your own product, identical, 5 months later, a year later. So the patent is what prevents that from happening.
So the patents essentially are in place to allow new drugs to be developed, to incentivize companies to make better drugs than what's out there. Because after patent expires, a company invests a lot of money and time in developing, and then the patent expires, that drug will then go generic. Generic manufacturers will make it, and they need to really move on to their next product that's hopefully better. And that's how technology improves over time, right?
Well, yeah, we've got this circle, if you will, because the brand name pharmaceutical companies know that their patent will expire in year X in 2025. They know that they need a newer product, a different product to come out in 2025 to fill up the pipeline and to make them money. Because once the patent on the original product expires, generic companies will make it, will sell it at a cheaper price, and they've lost something. So there's a cycle. So the innovator companies make a new product. That new product eventually becomes generic. The generic companies keep having a pipeline of innovative products to make generic. Mm-hmm. So we go round and round on the circle. That's essentially the way that it works.
Okay, so now regarding patent waivers, so there's been talk lately about potential patent waiver having to do with the COVID-19 epidemic. I think everyone who has been around, in the year 2020, now we're in 2021, understands that life is a bit different now for whatever reason. And pharmaceutical companies are actually producing vaccines, and we can see that the problem is slowly being dealt with, being tackled in certain countries, especially those with high vaccination rates. Tell me about this patent waiver, and what are your thoughts about it?
Before we get to the patent waiver, let's put this in a little perspective. Because what we're really dealing with here is we're dealing with issues relating of access to medicines for low-income countries, developing, least developed countries, which don't have access to medicines, to many medicines which we in the West have access to, many of them life-saving. If we take a look at the continent of Africa, the continent of Africa has somewhere around 35% of the disease burden of the world, and yet only 2% of the medical expenditures of the world. So clearly, Africa is losing out here. Africa is not getting the medicines at the same level and the other medical technologies that we in the West are getting, despite their disease burden. It's not distributed equitably. And we see that over and over again. The new products that are coming out are products which are mostly designed for Western countries. New vaccines, new sleeping sickness for years had no cures, because where were you going to sell your sleeping sickness pills? Only in Africa or in the Far East. You weren't selling them in North America and Europe, and that's where the money is. And there are a variety of diseases like that, vaccines like that also, just not available. So we have a problem of getting medical technologies and drugs to countries which need it. Now, this has been highlighted and exacerbated when we talk about COVID-19. If we take a look at the vaccine, which is incredible that it's been developed so quickly, that it's been developed in under a year, that we're all getting jabs here in Israel. Over 65% of the population has received it. In the U.S., just the past week, I think we've gone over the 50% have received at least one dose of the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. That's incredible. Yet once again, you go to the third world, the least developed countries, we're talking about under 2%. And it's going to remain that way for a long time. They're not getting vaccines there. And so one of the ways they're trying to meet that is what's called a patent waiver, which is a misnomer. It's not a patent waiver. This is a proposal that was made to the World Trade Organization, which regulates trade among countries, and in mid-1990s came out with an agreement called the TRIPS Agreement, Trade-Related Intellectual Property, which was an agreement between all the countries in the World Trade Organization, which said, we're going to impose patents in all countries around the world, and in return, we're going to distribute technology to everybody around the world. That was the basic framework of the agreement and set minimum patent standards around the world. And there's been a proposal to the World Trade Organization, which was first brought up in October of 2020 and was updated just last Friday, May 20th. It was a proposal initially proposed by India and South Africa, which was to waive all intellectual property rights, not just patents, but trademarks, copyrights, and trade secrets for a period. Now it's defined as a period of 3 years, as it relates to all COVID technologies. Whether it's vaccines, whether it's protective gear, whether it's diagnostic kits, all the various COVID-related technologies. And they would waive all rights on that, which would enable countries to make the vaccines on their own, would enable them to make other drugs or import other drugs which are used for treating COVID. And it would not be considered an infringement of this trade agreement, the TRIPS agreement. This is a possibility under TRIPS agreement to have this sort of waiver. It's commonly referred to as a patent waiver because patents are the main thing that we talk about relating to medical technologies, but it's a waiver of all intellectual property rights. And that's been proposed by South Africa, India, and it's being supported at the moment by over 60 countries. But we need a consensus of all 164 members of the TRIPS Council in order to pass it.
You had mentioned earlier that the U.S. Constitution gives inventors rights to protect their inventions through patents. Now, question is, how would an inventor, let's say in the U.S., that has this right, and he has an ability to protect his invention via a patent, how would the TRIPS patent waiver impact him? Is it possible to take away that right?
Yes, it is possible to take away that right. And actually, here in Israel, as relates to COVID, we've seen that. Last March, in March 2020, the Israel Health Minister, Rabbi Litzman, signed a declaration which allowed an Israeli company to import a drug treating COVID and which infringed, which violated the patent of AbbVie. Mm-hmm. And so Israel already did that. Israel was one of the first countries that, in fact, invoked a national emergency due to COVID and abrogated patent rights. Abrogated the patent rights of AbbVie. Any country can do that. Countries need to do that in order to make it happen. What this patent waiver would do would say, it's okay if you do it, countries. Israel did it before there was this patent waiver. Israel invoked their own patent law to do it. Mm-hmm. This would be a way of encouraging other countries to do something similar.
So this temporary patent infringement, which was sanctioned by the state and by the Attorney General under Section 104 for the COVID drug, this was the first time, as far as I understand, that this section of the law was invoked since the patent law was introduced in Israel in 1967. And when you look at the patent law, the continuation of that law in Section 108 says that there should be royalties set by the Compensation and Royalties Committee for that use that's sanctioned by the government. In other words, there's going to be a permission in a specific situation. In a case of emergency, the government determines that there's an emergency to, a sense, violate patent rights, but at the same time, there must be compensation that happens afterwards. Is that going to be part of the TRIPS patent waiver as well?
The proposal to the WTO doesn't address that at all, as far as I know. And I think that needs to be addressed in the individual countries, as it were. But once again, I think Israel here, we're in a luxurious situation where we can afford to pay for it. Israel's paying more for its COVID vaccines than almost any other country in the world in order to ensure a supply. We've got excess money in order to deal with these sorts of emergencies. When we're talking about the least developed countries, the problem is, up till now, with most pharmaceuticals, with many pharmaceuticals, has been the cost has been far too high to pay. And, what we're talking about now, AstraZeneca is donating vaccines to some of these countries. Moderna's donating vaccines or selling at cost. Similarly, Pfizer, BioNTech selling at cost. These are countries which, by and large, don't have that money to pay for these royalties or whatever you want to call them. Moderna says they're going to be selling their vaccine at the lowest tier. Pfizer's donating. AstraZeneca's been donating. This is not going to be a money-making process. Pfizer is talking about sales of $30 billion this year on vaccines, with profits of somewhere over $4 to $5 billion on the vaccines. Pfizer's not going hungry from this. I don't think they need the royalties from Africa to show shareholder profits this year.
So you're saying that their profits in first world countries will be sufficient, and they won't, even if they are distributing vaccines at cost or donating vaccines, they won't be losing money.
Well, this is the old argument. What is sufficient? You said that their profits will be sufficient. I am sure there are many people that will say, no, it's not sufficient. We deserve more.
Right.
But this has been the whole problem with access to medicines and cost of medicines, is what is a reasonable profit, and do we deny people access to medicines because they can't pay? That's a very fundamental issue, and this impacts, and this whole COVID situation has highlighted the inequitable access to medicines and the poor distribution of medicines around the world, and the poor distribution of technology for making medicines around the world.
You had mentioned earlier that this proposed waiver is not only a patent waiver, but also a waiver that will impact trade secrets, for example. Now, for a patent, I can understand that a person can read what's written in a patent and understand the technology and attempt to manufacture a drug based on that. However, a trade secret is a little bit tricky because a trade secret, as we know, is kept secret. Let's say companies are expected to transfer their trade secrets to other countries so that they can allow for manufacture for a limited amount of time. How do you ensure that the trade secret is only used for a limited amount of time? In other words, you can't just put that back in a box. You let the genie out and it's known. It's known in the public. The whole advantage of a trade secret is that it's kept private. How will that work in the framework of a waiver for trade secrets?
It's a good question. How will the trade secrets be transferred at all? The fact that you've given a patent waiver and you can read the patent doesn't mean you know how to make the vaccine. There are trade secrets involved. If Pfizer, Moderna don't want to transfer those trade secrets, how easy or how difficult will it be for other companies to make it? It will be much more difficult. So yes, there's an issue of trade secrets. I think the only aspect that I can relate to on that aspect of trade secrets is when Pfizer and Moderna filed with the FDA in order to get approvals for their vaccines, they had to rely on lots of clinical trials and clinical data. That data is protected as a trade secret. Yes, it's public, but it's protected. I cannot reference that. If I file with the FDA or elsewhere, I'm going to have trouble referencing it. If there's a waiver of the trade secrets, I will be able to reference the clinical data. I'll be able to reference their toxicology data, and I may not have to redo all of that. So that's an aspect of the trade secret which would become available under the waiver.
I see. Do you think it's likely that, given a time frame of 3 years, an IP waiver will actually help countries that are third world countries in manufacturing high-tech vaccines that they're on the cutting edge of technology? In other words, will the facilities in these third world countries be able to take this technology and use it within such a short period of time, relatively?
That's a great question, because I think the answer is that by and large, no. There's going to be a lot of difficulty in doing that. I think to a certain extent, this waiver is to incentivize companies to transfer the technologies to help make that happen. By analogy, in Israel, which used to have a compulsory license regime, where if you didn't manufacture the product in Israel, then another company could come along and say, I'm going to make it, and I force you to give me a license to make it. You don't transfer information to me, but I can make it under a forced license. that existed in Israel in the 70s and the 80s and was used quite successfully and incentivized companies to come to deals with Israeli companies rather than have to deal with compulsory licensing proceedings and losing compulsory licensing proceedings. They said, let's become friends. We'll license the patent to you. You'll make it. You can only make it for Israel, and we'll be friends. And I think here part of this is to incentivize it. On the other hand, yes, there is a possibility. There are facilities. We know of facilities in Bangladesh, in Canada, and elsewhere in the world which are sitting empty, have asked to make COVID vaccine, have tried to hook up with Johnson & Johnson, with Moderna, and they have not succeeded in hooking up with these countries. The Bangladesh facility is sitting empty. They know how to make vaccines. They've made vaccines in the past, maybe not the COVID vaccines, maybe not an mRNA vaccine. Maybe they'll make it using a different technology, the adenovirus vaccine technology or subunit particle. That's possible, but frequently in the West, we have this patronizing attitude that we're at the cutting edge, we know how to do everything, and no, you guys can't really do it quickly and you can't do it cheaply, and it's not going to happen. And over again, I think we've been surprised by what people can do in these countries. An example is the AIDS drugs. When Cipla came out and said we're going to make AIDS drugs for under $1 a pill, combination drugs, the Western company said, no, you can't do that. You can't make the combinations, fixed dose combinations of the AIDS drugs. It won't work and whatever. Now everybody sells them. That's the only thing that's sold. But it took Cipla, an Indian company, to make it, and to make it cheaply. Mm-hmm. We've seen that with the other vaccines, which people said couldn't be done. I think it's a Haemophilus vaccine. There's endless examples. So yes, we try to say, oh, this is really complicated. You can't possibly understand it. You can't possibly do it. You don't have the technology. And that's true for a lot of the countries. And that's true. They don't have the technology in many countries. On the other hand, there are pockets where it can be done, whether it's in India, Bangladesh, a few other countries. It can happen.
Do you think that if now there's a patent waiver, there's going to be a potential for abuse of this patent waiver system? In other words, is there some sort of slippery slope? This sort of patent waiver for TRIPS has not existed in the past on a worldwide scale. Will this become the norm? And will this erode the patent system, which, as we know, as you had mentioned, contributes greatly to the development of technology and the furthering of mankind?
I think there is the potential here for change. And I think it's a positive change because, as I've mentioned, the patent system has worked well for some populations, primarily certain populations in the Western countries, has not worked well for many of the populations, many of the people in developing countries and least developed countries. They've been totally failed by this patent system and by the system, the way medicines are delivered. What makes my blood bluer than the blood of somebody in Bangladesh? Why do I have access to COVID vaccines and they don't? Why do I have access to hepatitis vaccines and they don't? Mm-hmm. Why in a country like Uganda, with a population of 40 million people, over 40 million people, are there only 50 intensive care beds in the whole country? And we go around Israel, how many intensive care beds are there? Hundreds? Something's wrong. Something is broken with the system for developing and distributing medicines in the world. Yes, for you and me it works great, but what about the rest of the world? What about the other 50%, 70% of the world? And so yes, this is a slippery slope, but I think it is causing us all to reevaluate what this means for all of us. And perhaps it's only happening because of COVID and that you can't travel to Nepal now to go hiking on Annapurna and to go up the Himalayas because COVID in Nepal is going crazy, and you can't go to India. Similarly, all of a sudden we can't travel anywhere. World business has been impacted, so we're seeing that we're in a little bit of a small global farm, if you will. You know, we're all interconnected, and you know, we felt, we have good care. They don't. So what? We're seeing it's impacting all of us in one way or another, even though in Israel now we're all going back to our activities and everything seems fine, except for travel. Mm-hmm. So, you know, our global village is contracting in one sense. And yes, I think this is causing a reevaluation which is long overdue. And, it's a reevaluation which has been happening in many steps in Western countries up till now, where you've got Congress every so often looking into the cost of drugs and why is this drug costing $250,000 a year, $500,000 a year? What, is there no limit to the cost of drugs? And it's always justified, well, we spend a lot of money to develop it, there's not a lot of patients, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the same sort of thing that is happening on a much grander scale around the world, or should be happening, where people don't have access to the drugs, and it's not $500,000 a year drugs, but it's drugs for $5 a year or $5 a month. And this is, that same reevaluation that Congress is doing in the US every so often needs to be done on a global scale. And how do we develop drugs? And we've got great drugs, but how do we make them available to everybody? And how do we develop the right drug? Which is another problem we haven't discussed at all. Why are there no new antibiotics, for example? Well, because you can't make a lot of money on antibiotics. You make a lot more money on a hypertension drug, which you take every day, or diabetes drug, which you take every day. Antibiotic, after a week, you've cured the disease. So nobody's developing new antibiotics. Everybody's developing the third and fourth and fifth generation of hypertension drugs, or erectile dysfunction drugs, or whatever, because that's where the money is. Is that the way we really want to develop drugs and medicines? So I think this COVID crisis is forcing us into a reevaluation of this, and the patent waiver is just one aspect of that reevaluation. And hopefully it will be taken on a much broader level and not just focused on the patent waiver and not just focused on COVID, but on everything else as well. That's my hope.
Okay, thanks a lot, Yehudah. This has been very informative. I appreciate that you took the time to sit down with me and discuss these important issues. And I think we have a lot to think about, a lot to consider for going forward for the future of humanity and how it comes to play with patents and drug development. Thanks.
It's been great talking to you, Avi.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation with Avraham Hermon and Dr. Yehudah Livneh. We'd love to hear from you and see how we can help you with your intellectual property needs. You can learn more about JMB Davis Ben-David by going to our website, jmbdavis.com. We look forward to hearing from you. And if you'd like to hear more episodes with Avraham speaking with entrepreneurs, you can learn more at our podcast, Israeli Startup Founders Speak, which can be found wherever podcasts are played, or on our website, jmbdavis.com/podcast. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.